Austen's time, during the Regency period in England, mealtimes were very different from the present day. Prior to the invention of electricity, events were dictated by the availability of daylight. Breakfast was usually at around 10 o'clock in the morning and lasted about an hour, and lunch had not yet come into existence because it was not necessary when dinner was at around 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Mealtimes, however, were not the only dining difference of the Regency era. Deirdre LeFay, co-author of the Jane Austen cookbook, remarks that the greatest difference between our dinners and those of Jane Austen's time originates from the change of meaning that has taken place in the deceptively simple word course. What we call a 4-course meal today might have been one meager course in Jane Austen's time, as Regency courses consisted of anywhere from 5 to 25 items of all different types of food, and dinners usually had 2 of these courses, followed by dessert. Maggie Lane, author of Jane Austen and Food, reveals that dessert was a way of prolonging the meal with tidbits which could have been eaten using the fingers. Traditionally, it comprised a variety of dried fruits, nuts, and sweet and spicy confections. Rather than explore this style of 18th century dessert, we will examine a dish that constitutes a dessert in the modern day, but that was actually created in the 13th century. What today we call bread pudding came from very humble beginnings, originally referred to as poor man's pudding, because it presented a way for the poor to use leftover stale bread. The dish rose in status over the years, and in 1723, in John Knott's Cooks and Confectioners' Dictionary, it appeared under the name white pot, because the richer folks, like the Austens, who could afford to use cream instead of water, had adopted the recipe. Rice pudding was another variation of the recipe that came from the same origin. Jane Austen mentions rice pudding in her novel Emma, when Emma is leaving Mrs. Goddard's house with Mr. Elton and relates that
they were overtaken by Mr. John Knightley, returning from the daily visit to Donwell with his 2 eldest boys, whose healthy, glowing faces showed all the benefit of a country run, and seemed to ensure a quick dispatch of the roast mutton and rice pudding they were hastening home for.
As Mr. John Knightley and his sons are heading home for dinner, it is clear that both rice and bread pudding were not considered fancy enough to be served at assemblies and balls, but were perfectly acceptable to be enjoyed at home. Bread pudding was an Austen family favorite, beloved so much by Jane Austen that she even transcribed the recipe into poetic verse. Bread pudding is made by combining butter and sugar, beating in eggs, then adding white bread, followed by cloves, mace, salt, pepper, grated lemon rind, and currants. Finally, enough milk or cream is added to saturate the bread before baking. The Austen family recipe specifically calls for white bread, which is made with white flour, and therefore is an indication of both the Austen family's social status and of the historical context of the age. White, or refined flour, had the germ and bran removed during the milling process, which made it more popular because of its fine texture and increased shelf life. Until the end of the 18th century, grist mills were the main means of flour production, but were improved during the beginning of the Industrial Revolution era by the addition of silk sieves imported from China, which ensured a finer and whiter flour. In 1786, however, the first steam mill was raised on the banks of the Thames. This mill, as the name indicates, featured the steam engine, which was the driving force behind British industrialization. In the beginning of the British Industrial Revolution, however, the technology was so new that the finest, whitest steam mill-produced flour was still novel enough that it was affordable only for members of the upper classes. Unlike white flour, many ingredients in bread pudding, like milk, eggs, and butter, were produced directly on the estate. Some specific ingredients, however, like lemons and currants, were symbols of status and wealth because of their exotic origins. Lemons and currants were imported from the Iberian Peninsula, and spices like mace from Asia. These ingredients demonstrate the far reach of the British Empire's extensive global trade network, but the most well-known part of this network manifests itself in an ingredient so common that we use it on a daily basis. Sugar, which is derived from the tropical grass sugarcane, was produced in the West Indies after its introduction in the mid-17th century, and became one of the largest crops aside from tobacco and cotton. These 3 crops presented raw ingredients that could be processed and refined in the new industrial age gathering momentum in Britain. Because of this, the West Indies became one vertex of the British Empire's triangular trade system. Triangular trade is a system of trade in which a country pays for imports from one country with its exports to another. The most famous and infamous system of triangular trade was the transatlantic slave trade, which involved the exchange of textiles and manufactured goods from Britain for slaves in West Africa. The slaves were then shipped to the West Indies, where they were exchanged for sugar, rum, tobacco, and cotton, which was shipped back to Britain, completing the triangle. The complex histories and sources of all of the ingredients that make up such a simple dish show us that we take the origin of our food for granted on a daily basis. The phrase, "you are what you eat," has become a common colloquial phrase, proving that the food we eat every day is not merely sustenance, but a representation of our lifestyles. But more than that, food is a direct reflection of the cultural elements and historical context from which it comes. So when we mix together ingredients, we are actually mixing together various multifaceted cultures and histories.